trying to understand how Sri Lanka could come to this situation where suddenly we find that we don't have any money to buy things. Why is it that there are no forward forecasting models, and maybe organizations like yours, which are think tanks, that couldn't have alerted the government? Because if this was done 6 months back, we wouldn't be in this situation today. Your thoughts, please.
That's a good question, actually. That's some sort of question we also have. Actually, we engage. We have different ways of communicating our research finding. Actually, IPS is a semi-government think tank. We are in a lot of technical committees. We communicate, disseminate our evidence-based policy recommendations. It is totally up to the policymaker actually to take them and make a move. It was delayed. I think it was the burden is on the policymaker. That's the thing actually. As researchers, we can do research. As an example, in 2021, once I came back to Sri Lanka to work here, my first work was about the impact of these import controls on Sri Lanka's economy. Import controls of raw materials inevitably affect Sri Lanka's production, manufacturing process. We disseminated that. So it is up to the politicians to whether to accept those and act upon those recommendations. Other thing is that forecasting models and these econometric models, we use them and try to disseminate in non-technical manner as much as possible, because policymakers are not interested in this technical analysis. Another burden we are facing is actually we don't have these softwares and stuff. As an example, in the US and countries like Australia, they have these sophisticated softwares and systems. They have incorporated into policy analysis. There are different government units which run those models and analyze the impact. That is not happening in Sri Lanka. We do what we can, and I think it is up to the policymaker to act upon those recommendations.
Good evening and a warm welcome to another session in the MBA Diaries, where you will be meeting an expert. And especially as Asia Pacific Institute of Information Technology, we are honored to be hosting this session today amid a lot of other challenges nationally and internationally. However, you will be meeting a global veteran and of course a veteran from the global corporate world, who will be sharing thoughts and experiences which you cannot take in just another theory or just another book. So especially in a time where we are talking about challenging discussions, I am so thankful that this guest today has come on board with us with such short notice to give us a lot of information and a lot of insights about the current status. So with that, I would like to warmly welcome all the students from Staffordshire University in our postgraduate programs and also in our undergraduate program, as well as in our doctorate programs, who are joining us today. And all the foreign delegates who are with us here today from Staffordshire University, from Deakin University, from AIT Thailand, and of course, all the other universities around the world as time permits that you're joining us. Then, of course, a warm welcome to all the foreign delegates and diplomats who are with us today in the platform. And with that, I bring you a message from our CEO and our chairman on behalf of the Directorate of APIT. There's a special message thanking all the students and all the viewers in the platform, including the special speaker who is with us today. So that welcome message and then that greeting is sent to you by Mr. Bandula Godage, our chairman of APIT Sri Lanka. So with that expressions, I would like to hand over the platform to Dr. Rohantha Tukorala, a director of APIT Sri Lanka, and of course, one of the pioneering individuals, or rather the epicenter of networking, who is behind this special task of getting these opportunities of rather for students to meet up with these veterans of the corporate world. So with that, Dr. Rohantha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kaushali, and appreciate sincerely for the message that was given by the chairman, who is also the president of the Industrial Association of Sri Lanka, and of course, the vice president of Nestle. Today, we have a very honored guest, a guest I met yesterday at the European Union program that was staged at Kingsbury. His name is, synonymous, is a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka with research interest in international trade. He is also interested in the impact of adjustments of costs and trade, gravity modeling in trade, econometrics, and trade origins of the populistic politics. He has undertaken efficiency analysis, particularly public spending efficiency, using parameters and non-parametric efficiency analysis approach. He also holds a BSc in Agricultural Technology and Management from the University of Peradeniya, and is a MSc in Agribusiness and Applied Economics from the North Dakota State University, and an MIS in PhD in Agriculture Environmental Development Economics from Ohio State University. I have immense pleasure in to introduce Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe, Research Fellow for the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, and a very, very respected speaker who was actually a guest yesterday at the EU Russia Sanctions of Russia program that was held at Kingsbury. Dr. Asanka, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rohantha. I'm not in a position to share the video. Actually, there's a power cut right now. Okay, I think slides are visible for you.
Yes. Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Asanka Wijesinghe. I will talk about the impact of Russian invasion and the subsequent sanctions on Sri Lanka's economy. We all know that the post-COVID recovery of global economy was much under stress due to supply chain bottlenecks and rising inflation. And with all of this, we got a conflict in Europe. With Russia's invasion, US and the EU promptly imposed financial sanctions, and we can identify three planks of these sanctions. One thing is expansion of sanctions of individuals, especially the Russian business tycoons, and sanctions against Russian banks, especially disconnection from the SWIFT global messenger system. And the most important sanction was the incapacitation of the central bank of the Russian Federation as the use of its international reserves. With these things, we need to talk what is the level of Sri Lanka's exposure to these sanctions and what will be the economic impact on Sri Lanka. One question we need to ask is, do sanctions matter? Whether sanctions actually a powerful tool of the Western countries. The impact of sanctions on Central Bank of Russia seemed to be really effective. You can see the exchange rate of ruble with the starting of invasion. It went up. This was mainly after the sanctions on Central Bank of Russia. However, Russia could brought it down because of its current account surplus. Russia is a permanent major energy exporter, and they use that income revenue to control the impact of these sanctions. And another feature of these sanctions are they are carefully targeted to minimize economic disruption, and the energy related transactions are not affected. However, there is increasing pressure on EU to take more actions. As an example, energy import ban and sanctions on major Russian banks. So thus, these future escalations will, of course, generate high risks for Sri Lanka. I identify 4 channels how Sri Lanka can be affected. One thing is, of course, payments for imports and exports can be affected because Russia is cut off from a SWIFT system. Many of the Russian banks are cut off from the SWIFT messenger service. So it is a trouble for Sri Lanka's banking system when making payments and receiving payments. Another important thing is with these sanctions, recession in Russia is possible, and with that, demand for Sri Lanka's exports can go down. The third channel is a potential recession in the EU, European Union. There is a kind of an indication that Russia will counter sanction, use sanctions to counterattack the EU's move. And if, as an example, if Russia cuts down the energy exports, especially the gas exports to Russia, to the EU, then recession is likely in the EU, which will impact Sri Lanka's exports to the EU because demand can go down. But all of these 3 measures are trivial when we compare Sri Lanka's exposure to the commodity market. I identify Sri Lanka's exposure to commodity market, base metals, crude oil, and agricultural commodities could be the major channel that Sri Lanka can be affected. Sri Lanka's exposure to Russia and Ukraine are actually trivial. If you look at the export data, just 2% of, about 2.2% of exports in 2020 went to Russia and Ukraine. However, this overall picture masks many other undercurrents, the underlying features of Sri Lanka's exposure to Russia and Ukraine. As an example, both countries are important trade partners in certain sectors. About 45% of Sri Lanka's wheat imports are from Russia and Ukraine. And about 18% of fermented black tea goes to Russia and Ukraine. You can see from this figure, this red color is the Sri Lanka's imports from Russia, and the yellow color is the Sri Lanka's imports in from Ukraine. You can see we export about nearly 150 million worth wheat from Russia, and more than, I think, 80% of asbestos are coming from Russia. Some wheat and also sunflower oil are coming from Ukraine. When it comes to exports, you can see Sri Lanka exports more than 85% of black tea to the rest of the world. So it is just about 18% to both countries, Russia and Ukraine. My point is, Sri Lanka's trade exposure to these 2 countries is overall smaller, but in certain sectors like black tea and wheat import and black tea exports our exposure is pretty much large. So what will happen to the Russian economy with these sanctions? There are model-based general equilibrium analysis done by the researchers. It is predicted that the industrial production of Russia can go down by about 21% to 27%, and as a result of that, the subsequent GDP contraction can be about 12.5% to 16.5. The ultimate outcome is private consumption of Russians can be lower by about 11% to 15%. As a result of this, Russia will import less, and the ultimate outcome will be their trade balance will grow by about 40 to 60%. So with this outcome, there is a significant risk for Sri Lanka's tea exports. And however, overall, due to less dependence on Russian economy, overall impact on Sri Lanka's economy might be trivial through these trade linkages. However, given the deepened reserve crisis Sri Lanka is currently facing, every dollar matters. So we cannot argue that this is just a small impact and we cannot ignore because Sri Lanka's situation is pretty much difficult right now. This shows Sri Lanka's exports exposure to the EU. This is very important market for Sri Lanka. You can see the EU 27 accounts for about 2.453 billion US dollars of exports from Sri Lanka, and another nearly 1 billion to the United Kingdom. So Sri Lanka is pretty much exposed to the EU market. If something is happening in the EU, like an economic contraction or recession, it will affect directly Sri Lanka's exports because the European demand for Sri Lanka's goods can go down. So what would be the economic impact on the EU economy? Cutting Russia's fossil fuel exports. A gradual reduction may have, of course, a trivial impact. As an example, EU households' real income could drop by 0.3 to 0.6. So in that scenario, assume that the European Union will stop importing Russia's fossil fuel. The impact is trivial. Household income will go down just by 0.3 or to 0.6. However, these models do not take politics into account always. As an example, in such scenario, energy price can go up by about 6.8 to 8%. And the poorest US household spend about 11.3% of their income on energy and transport fuels. So the political pressure for the European politicians will be pretty much high. Another important thing is that these estimates are for a scenario where the fossil fuel exports cut down will be gradual. Let's assume there is an abrupt cutting of the EU from Russian energy. That means the EU economy decides, okay, we are not going to import Russian energy at all. That would generate devastating economic shock on the EU economy. The estimated cumulative loss is roughly about 220 billion euros, and it is about over 6.5% of annual economic output. This would result in growth of just 1.9% this year and a contraction of 2.2% in 2023. Such a scenario will be a red flag for Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka exports seafood, Sri Lanka exports tea, and Sri Lanka exports especially the ready-made garments to the EU, and we are benefited by the EU's GSP plus. As a result of that, EU is a major export destination for Sri Lanka's exports. So this is a pretty gloomy situation if there will be abrupt cutting off of the EU from Russian energy. However, as I said, compared to those three channels, the most important channel is Sri Lanka's exposure to the commodity market. With the start of invasion, almost all the commodities rallied up. You can see this vertical line, blue color vertical line is the onset of war, the start of war on February 24th. With that, these agricultural commodity prices rallied up, especially wheat. You can see that because the Black Sea transport channels was anticipated to be affected, and as a result of that, the market is speculated, so the futures price went up. With this wheat price, all the other commodities like soybean also rallied up, US corn rallied up, and this crude palm oil rallied up because the anticipation was that sunflower production will be affected, and as a result of that, the Ukraine vegetable oil exports would be affected. Thus, palm oil is a substitute for this sunflower oil and vegetable oil. So crude palm oil also rallied up. The other striking feature is the base metal prices. You can see copper, aluminum, zinc, nickel, almost all of these base metals prices rallied up after the war. They came down to some extent, but still the price levels are higher than the pre-crisis prices. This is what happened to the commodity market of crude oil. Brent and West Texas intermediate categories both rallied up. Initially, the market thought that the sanctions will be on energy transactions too, but later the market learned that energy transactions are pretty much exempted from these sanctions. So prices came down, but still you can see the oil price are higher than the pre-crisis level. So why does this matter to Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka, if you compare 2019 imports and 2021, we have imported more medicines, more machinery and equipment, more base metals, more oils and fats, and more refined petroleum compared to 2019. And also wheat and maize and coal. So the implication is that if you look at our trade deficit, these commodities like base metals, refined petroleum, machinery and base metals, refined petroleum, plastic articles, and those products contribute more to our trade deficit. So once these prices will go up, it is already higher in the world market, the pressure on our trade deficit will grow. You know, Sri Lanka has a dollar shortage. So if we spend $100 to buy something about 2 months ago, now maybe we have to pay about $150. So it is a pressure on Sri Lanka's economy. This is the major channel of impact I identify from this war and the sanctions. So what would be the policymakers' response? So the regulators' response. What they did was, from last April, they imposed a lot of import controls. That means Sri Lanka brought many imports under import control license, credit basis requirements, some were temporarily suspended, and some products imports are totally banned. In that case, we can assume that the policymaker will exempt capital and intermediate goods and more complex goods, because those are vital for the Sri Lanka's economy. Intermediate goods are necessary to produce most of the products in Sri Lanka. As an example, although we generate about $4 billion from textiles, we import about 2 billion worth intermediate goods to produce that 5 billion worth textiles. This figure shows you that overall, yes, the policymaker had tried to exempt intermediate goods. You can see the coefficient is negative. That means that the probability of an intermediate good to be subjected to import controls were less than the consumption commodities. However, with our reserve crisis deepened, policymaker had to control even intermediate products. You can see in wave 5, the probability is positive. And you can see this product complexity. The argument is that the complex products, we cannot produce them in Sri Lanka, so we need to import them. Those are necessary for Sri Lanka's economy. So we can expect the policymaker exempt them. But you can see, although in the first waves, in the earlier period, that means around 2021 April, policymaker exempted complex products, but with time that coefficient became positive. And in import controls, food commodities are disproportionately targeted because Sri Lanka policymakers and some people believe that these are substitutable. As an example, turmeric, it was totally banned. And as a result of that, Sri Lanka's domestic turmeric price is skyrocketed. These are the import controls currently practiced by Sri Lanka. You can see about 4 billion intermediate goods and import controls. This is a problem for domestic producers. We had a chat with the leading confectionery producer. Actually, their raw materials are affected by the most recent wave of import controls. If you know, about 360 commodities were subjected to import control license about 1 month ago. They have to submit an application to the Ministry of Industries, then it should be approved by Ministry of Finance. So it is a huge process. So with this sanctions and with this war, if the prices will further rally up and our trade deficit will be under pressure, this import controls can be tightened, and that can affect our economy a lot. So in conclusion, among these 4 channels I identified, Sri Lanka's exposure to commodity market is the most worrisome impact, and it may generate widening trade deficit, and import controls as a measure to manage economic crisis could be identified as policymakers' strategy to control this issue. However, though the policymakers and even some economists argue that we can restrict non-essential imports, it is extremely hard to identify whether a commodity is essential or not. As an example, cheese, wine, and those kind of products may be categorized as non-essential commodities, but they are required for the tourism industry, like that. And manufacturing sector needs the raw materials. So there can be an impact on industrial production. As I showed you, the food commodities are disproportionately targeted by these import controls. This is anti-poor because poor people eat a lot of imported calories. With this gloomy picture, the positive sign for Sri Lanka's economy is the move to achieve that sustainability and solving BOP crisis through IMF discussion. If we can improve our reserve situation and achieve debt sustainability in the short and medium run, we can face these adverse effects of the global developments. I think then we can gradually remove import controls and revive the production process of the country. Thanks all. These are my views about this crisis. I thank Rand for inviting me to talk with you guys.
Thank you very much, Asanka. It was a brilliant discussion which you shared. Um, there are a whole heap of questions coming. I'm going to take one by one each of the questions coming from our team. Um, the first question is coming from Binuri, who works for the London Stock Exchange, and she's saying that um, will the impact of the sanctions by EU to Russia have an impact to the overall global GDP that was estimated for the year 2022 by World Bank or IMF? What impact will it do to the total global economic growth?
Mhm. Yeah, actually, the current studies mostly focused on these two economies, Russia and EU. It depends on a lot of factors, especially what would be the future course of action. Uh, Energy import ban by EU will generate negative economic impact on most of the EU economies. The current estimate is that the EU economy can contract by about 2.2% in 2023, and 2022 growth is reduced, will be reduced to about 1.6. Like that, I don't know the exact numbers about the global GDP growth, but we can roughly estimate that the global growth will be reduced if such drastic measures will be taken, like a total energy import ban. It is on the table. Actually, there are discussions, but initially, what we learned was that the EU, especially countries like Germany, they were carefully they exempted energy transactions in their sanctions, and also they did not sanction the big Russian banks. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Asanka. That was really good. There's a question coming in from Dasit, and he's saying, "This is the first time we have had a speaker, all CEOs coming in and talking to us in the last 1 year. First time we are having a econometric specialist coming and talking, and I think it's a great honor to have you talk to us." Uh, his question is that uh, the people who are into tea exports use indirect methods of exporting from a nearby country, like countries like Poland. So even if you have a import or sanction from the EU, people work indirect exports. Will this have an impact uh, to somebody getting blacklisted? And isn't this another way in which trade works around such sanctions?
Mhm. Actually, I'm not much familiar about that process, but my understanding and what I learned from yesterday's talk was that the major issue is about the transactions, like financial transactions, how to make sure that the transactions are genuine and they will be met as the agreements. This comes from the taking off of Russian banks from this SWIFT messenger system. I think generally food exports are exempted from these sanctions. I meant, I assume that Sri Lankan firm exports tea to Russia. I don't think it is a reason for being blacklisted. The issue is surrounding this how to make the payments and how Russia can make the payment, because some banks are taken away from SWIFT system. In the US case, as I know, in the EU case, as I know, what they do is they do the transactions through the financial institutions that are not subjected to these sanctions. So that's my understanding about this.
Thank you, Asanka. There's a question coming in from Umaya, and she works in one of the top multinational hotel chains in Sri Lanka, and she's saying, what impact would this whole sanctions have on the tourism industry of Sri Lanka? Because most of the tourism of Sri Lanka comes from Europe. Your view, please, Doctor.
Sanctions may not have a direct impact, but sanctions related, I meant, as I said, the sanctions can generate economic recession in both parties, like the EU and Ukraine and Russia. Not only EU, actually, Sri Lanka gets a lot of tourists from Russia and Ukraine. So as an example, if household income will be affected, then the EU tourists may not have much money to spend in Sri Lanka, and EU households may cut down those travel expenses. Other worrisome development is the increase of defense budget in these European countries. As an example, Germany committed to allocate about 2% of their GDP after this crisis to the defense. We call this as peace dividends. Actually, after the World War, when the world was in much peace, households had a lot of money to spend. So they consumed them, they spend them for traveling. So they came to Sri Lanka, they imported products from Sri Lanka. So that economic contraction, potential economic contraction, and possibly increase of defense expenditures in the European countries might affect the tourist industry of Sri Lanka.
Right. There's a question coming from Dulaj, and the question is, Dr. Wijesinghe, could you let us know, when a country goes bankrupt, what happens to the overall standing with regard to the ratings that you get on whether you are a middle income, low middle income, or a poor country, which is, I think, a World Bank classification. How does that imply to Sri Lanka?
Yes, these income classifications are done by actually looking at the per capita income level. Let's assume that Sri Lanka has now suspended all the external debt obligations. It is like soft default. There are some people telling there is no hard default and soft default. Default is default, but this is a bit of a different situation for Sri Lanka. In a default, what can happen is our ability to refinance our debt is now over, and there is reducing investor confidence, and it is possible that the investors take out their investment from Sri Lanka. In that case, there will be unemployment, like job loss. The overall impact will be economic contraction. Let's assume that Sri Lanka economy will not grow. Instead of that, it would contract. In that case, our GDP level will go down compared to the previous country. Once it is divided by the number of population, now the per capita income level is low. That's the possible avenue that our rankings will be affected. If Sri Lanka's per capita GDP will go down, then our income designations categories will be changed. It is we cannot solidly say what would be the outcome. It depends on a lot of factors. If there will be IMF bailout and everything will be done according to a plan swiftly, we can mitigate a lot of economic impacts.
Thank you, Doctor. There's a question coming from Shamini, and she's saying that what is the impact of money printing to economic growth? Because there are two schools of thought which says that when you print money, you have to print money in a typical economy. But there's another school of thought that when you print money, you have inflation happening. And she's saying, even though the government took a decision that they're going to control inflation, why is it that April 18th, there was almost 2 billion worth of money printed? How does this impact inflation?
Yes, actually, there's this modern monetary theories. They think that we can print money. The issue is this modern monetary theory may be applicable for a country like US, that their currency has a global demand. Dollar has a global demand. But in Sri Lanka's case, rupee does not have a global demand. I think that money printing was not successful. In the general economic theories like this, when there are more money circulation in the economy, people will bring that money and demand for goods. Then the goods are not actually produced. Just money is being more printed. So then due to the high demand, the price level will go up. That's the general economic understanding. But these textbook situations are pretty much different when it comes to politics and the ground realities. When the government needs financing, what they do is borrowing from the central bank. I believe that the money printing directly affect the inflation levels. High inflation is of course bad for the economy. One thing is the distributional impact. As an example, poor people can be more poor because right now the goods are expensive. The income is stagnated. As a result of that, their purchasing power will go down. Then they will not be able to fulfill their basic calorie requirements. The other thing is that the investors, they don't like inflation, so they don't invest in high inflation countries. That's my view about this money printing and inflation and the impact on the economy.
Thank you, Doctor. There is a question coming from Isuruni, and she's saying that if IMF says for a country to restructure its loans and make it sustainable before getting into IMF program, but then if the bilateral countries do not agree for a restructuring of the loans,
Mhm.
but are saying, why don't we bail you out? But you don't need to go to the IMF. I mean, what is the options that a typical country has?
Mhm. Yeah, it is actually, we are seeing these media reports that especially China does not like to restructure their debt. I think what IMF asking is a plan for debt sustainability. Then the Sri Lanka policymaker can decide which debts can be restructured and which can be exempted. I think our major worry is not bilateral loans, but the ISBs, international sovereign. International sovereign bonds, there is a various pool of creditors in that. Some actually we cannot identify them, but the government knows who has lend them, who are the creditors. So the government will have to discuss with them what kind of restructuring can be practiced. As an example, are we going to cut the interest rates, or are we going to cut the coupon payments, like we call it haircut, like if you have to pay $100, okay, we come to an agreement with the creditors to accept $80, like that. In this case, I think the Sri Lanka government's option is to show the government will manage well the revenues and expenditures, and the government will increase the revenue through prudent taxations. And when it comes to restructuring of debt, the government can negotiate with the creditors of ISBs, these sovereign bonds. Sometimes I feel that these bilateral refinancing, as an example, China is telling they are willing to give us another loan to pay the existing loans. It may be a good thing because we don't need to borrow more from high interest capital markets. For a typical country, what is the available option? That question is actually Sri Lanka's option is to discuss with the creditors of ISBs, sovereign bonds, and try to restructure that debt and do bilateral negotiations to refinance debt, not restructure, but refinance those debts. Yeah.
There's another good question coming from Iran. Uh, it says, "Thank you very much, Doctor, uh, for a very comprehensive economic review, which is very straightforward, and for being absolutely forthright, because we as students, we are trying to understand how different variables play and how we need to adjust the way that our companies need to operate. I work in a software company, and I'm trying to understand how Sri Lanka could come to this situation where suddenly we find that we don't have any money to buy things. Why is it that there are no forward forecasting models, and maybe organizations like yours, which are think tanks, that couldn't have alerted the government? Because if this was done 6 months back, we wouldn't be in this situation today. Your thoughts, please.
That's a good question, actually. That's some sort of question we also have. Actually, we engage. We have different ways of communicating our research finding. Actually, IPS is a semi-government think tank. We are in a lot of technical committees. We uh, communicate, disseminate our evidence-based policy recommendations. It is totally up to the policymaker actually to take them and make a move. It was delayed. I think it was the burden is on the policymaker. That's the thing actually. As researchers, we can do research. As an example, in 2021, once I came back to Sri Lanka to work here, my first work was about the impact of these import controls on Sri Lanka's economy. Import controls of raw materials inevitably affect Sri Lanka's production, manufacturing process. We disseminated that. So it is up to the politicians to whether to accept those and act upon those recommendations. Other thing is that forecasting models and these econometric models, we use them and try to disseminate in non-technical manner as much as possible, because policymakers are not interested in this technical analysis. Another burden we are facing is actually we don't have these softwares and stuff. As an example, in the US and countries like Australia, they have these sophisticated softwares and systems. They have incorporated into policy analysis. There are different government units which run those models and analyze the impact. That is not happening in Sri Lanka. We do what we can, and I think it is up to the policymaker to act upon those recommendations.
Okay. One last question coming out, Asanka. It's coming from Sachini. She's saying, could you give us an idea of how the next 3 months is going to pan out for Sri Lanka? Because nobody has given us a view of what to expect in the next 3 months.
Well, to summarize or to tell it using few words, there is no painless way out of this crisis. As the citizens of this country, Sri Lankans will have to cut down many things. Consumption to some extent. Our reserve levels are dangerously low. If we will not be able to build them in short run, we will not be able to import commodities like fuel and gas, and also in Sri Lanka right now there is a food shortage. If you know that there are actually the actual yield data is not released, but the understanding is that yield loss of paddy was about 40% due to the fertilizer ban. So that will affect in the coming the food prices in the coming 3 months if Sri Lanka will not be able to import rice to compensate that the production loss. And about this IMF deal, it is unlikely that Sri Lanka will be able to get financing and then to agree upon package within this 3 months. It will take some time. I think 3 months mean May, June, July. Yeah, at least it will take until July to know what would be the level of or the magnitude of the package. And IMF packages come with conditions, and that conditions ask the government to cut down expenditures. You know, there are people who use those government assistance to make a living or to make sure they have the basic necessities. So they will be much affected by those things. So in 3 months, as I said, there is no painless way out of this crisis. There should be some sacrifices, as I feel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asanka. I mean, you beautifully summed up the impact of the global market based on the sanctions which have been put by EU to the Russia. And I think that very important was what was mentioned yesterday at the conference was that these sanctions are not punitive. They are more to do with targeted sanctions, which actually is about trying to change behavior of Russia with regard to peace and reconciliation and overall quality of life. So that is what was said, and you beautifully explained the economic implications of that. And also, thank you so much, Doctor, for taking your time off to explain a little bit about the uncertainties we have in Sri Lanka and what we should expect in terms of the management. So it was great to have you. My sincere thanks to you for actually accepting this invite in such a short time. I mean, it's lovely meeting you. It's so great to have the honor of meeting a caliber of your person with your kind of background, who can really see the kind of impact it can have into this country. I sincerely hope you would stay with us. I know you are global material. You came down only in 2021 from abroad, but I think Sri Lanka needs you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. Wijesinghe. And can I hand you the platform to Kaushali, please?
Thanks, Rohan. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Indeed, as Dr. Rohantha very clearly said, this is definitely a time that we need you in Sri Lanka for the expertise and for knowledge sharing. And as we always tell the students, this is something that is coming to you uniquely from each and every veteran who is sharing their thoughts today, which you cannot find this information, of course, in theoretical books around. So thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us today. And with that, we come to the end of another session, and we'll meet back again in another week's time. Until then, take care of yourselves and good night from Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Kaushal, and good night all.
Good night. Thank you so much again. Appreciate Dr. Asanka.
Thanks, Rohan. Good night.
Good night.